everyone. Thank you so much for having me. I'm honored to participate in this conference as a plenary speaker. Today, I am going to talk about the fire problem in the West, and I really want to reframe it so that we're not focusing on it as something that's separate from us. I think it's not something that's happening to us. Rather, it's really something that's reflective of our larger approach and stewardship ethic in the West, and something we can change. So let's talk about the fire problem as a cultural problem. I think we're used to thinking about the fire problem in acres. You know, that's the main gist of what we hear in the media and from fire management agencies. Everything we talk about is how big the fires are, you know, how many of the top fire sizes we've had in this year versus other years. And so this is a really good example. This is a great figure that's come out from CAL FIRE that shows that 5 of the biggest fires in recorded California history have happened in 2020. Of course, these are important things to pay attention to, but acres really aren't able to capture the extent of the fire problem. And I think it's important to remember that, you know, we're just at about 4.2 million acres burned in California this year. And that's still not actually even comparable with the historical annual acreage that's estimated to have burned in California before European settlement. So Scott Stevens and some colleagues have done some great work trying to recreate the number of acres that were burned historically in California. And they estimate it at somewhere around 4.5 million acres every year. So the fact that we're at 4.2 million acres, when you view it in that historical context, may not be quite as appalling as we may think. And the fire problem really is not just about fire size. We also know that some of the areas that are burning, even this year, you know, we of course, a lot of areas burned at high severity and have had, you know, devastating effects, but a lot of areas are burning under lower severities and doing some good work. So we can see there on the right a soil burn severity map for the south zone of the August complex, which is burning somewhat close to me. I'm on the north coast of California, and we see a lot of green in there. So these fires are not all bad all the time, and it's not just about how big they are. I think what I want to think about is the fire problem is really about the social and cultural values that are being lost, and how we as people are going to persist in the West, and how we're going to be able to learn to live with fire. So, you know, it's not just external from us, it's really about our values and how we're going to come up with solutions that can maintain our values and keep our landscapes and our communities safe. So I want to explore some of those values that I think are being lost and that really should be more of the gist of how we talk about the fire problem. And of course, communities, homes, and lives are top of the list, and we've lost at this point 31 people and more than 9,000 structures in California to the 2020 wildfires. And you know, clearly the value of keeping our communities and our homes and our lives intact in the face of fire is a huge value and something that should be driving our work on this. But there are a lot of other things too that we need to be thinking about. And I don't know how many of you saw Dave Daly's writing earlier this year in September. He is a Butte County cattleman who was affected by the North Complex. And he wrote the most eloquent and really touching piece about his family and their livelihood and legacy and how it's been impacted not only by the wildfires this year, but by decades and decades of political debate around fire and fuels and logging and climate, and how, you know, it's just, it's not in line with the stewardship ethic that he and others have for their places. And at the end of the day, this conversation really needs to be about place and about stewardship and not just about politics and who's right or wrong. So I highly recommend looking that up, and you can Google his name, but find that piece of writing that he did. It's very eloquent and very touching, and I think really gets at the loss of livelihood and legacy that we're seeing with our fire management approach and our fire culture. And of course, our beloved landscapes. I think, this has been a big thing that we've been talking about this year in the context of the fires. We had the fire burn in Big Basin, fires burning in Joshua Trees. We are collectively grieving over the loss of our beloved landscapes and species and the things that we hold dear. And so this is one of those values, I think, that again should be driving our work in fire and should really be helping shape our fire culture, is what are the things that we care about and how are we going to keep these things on the landscape in the face of a changing climate and changing fire regimes. These need to be at the center of our work. What do we love and what do we care about? And those are cultural values. We may think of them as ecological resources or just kind of nature as separate from us, but really these are cultural values, cultural centerpieces. And this really ties to stewardship. Bill Tripp of the Karuk tribe wrote a really beautiful op-ed in The Guardian earlier this year in September. And I urge you to look this up and hear from him. Bill has such a great insight into these issues. And I think that, in addition to grieving our beloved landscapes, as I talked about on the last slide, or our livelihoods and legacy, we're also grieving stewardship and the fact that we have, in large part, as society, kind of lost our connection to place, to the landscape. And there's so much we can learn from people like Bill and from the indigenous people who have been managing, shaping, and stewarding these landscapes for so long. So this brings me to a big point, I think, that I've been thinking about. And it's really, what is cultural burning? We're used to thinking of cultural burning in a tribal fire management context, using fire for cultural resource management. And I think we could think about it a little more broadly and try to learn from it. And I like to think about cultural burning as people having a reciprocal relationship with fire, where what we put into fire, it comes back to us. And so in that light, I would argue that the recent wildfires we're seeing, these in recent years and recent decades, these are cultural burning as well. These are a direct reflection of our relationship with fire and with our landscape. And the fact that we are so far departed from what is actually natural as humans, which is to have a relationship with fire that can be positive and beneficial. And so these fires and the fire regimes we're seeing, and the fire severities and the whole nature and character of fire as we know it now, is really a reflection of our culture. And this is not anything new. We know that humans have long shaped landscapes and fire regimes. And one of my favorite papers of all time is a paper that Alan Taylor and several other colleagues put out in 2016. And it looked at the relationship between fire regime shifts in the Sierra Nevada of California. And it really set out to look at how those shifts in fire regimes were related to climate patterns. What they found is that they were finding pretty weak relationships there, and realized that they had to add in the layer of human management and settlement patterns and kind of the human dynamics in the Sierra Nevada. And that's where they were able to find the relationship to the fire regimes. The fire regime shifts in the Sierra Nevada over the last 400 years were directly related to the ways that people were living on and managing the landscape, not to climate. So the human management was actually able, during certain periods, to override the effects of climate. And what a powerful message that is. And especially relevant in our time now, where we're dealing with these complex interactions between climate and fire and fuels, and having a hard time finding where humans fit into all of that. Well, guess what? We're at the center of all of that. And it's defining who we are as people living in the West right now. So that gets me thinking about, as we move forward in California, in the West, even nationally and globally, we really need to think about what we value, because we are the most powerful force for change and for fire in this world. And so why don't we own that a little bit and really think about how do we move forward, and how do we define and claim a culture with fire that makes more sense for us? Because what we're seeing now it's not working. And I think that there's some great work out there that can help inform and empower us. And so my dear friend, Dr. Sarah Ray at Humboldt State University, put out a book earlier this year called A Field Guide to Climate Anxiety. And this book is really focused on tools and strategies for dealing with climate change and all the anxiety and the eco grief that it's causing in people all over the place, and especially in young people who are faced with a future that is very uncertain and scary. I think the lessons in her book are incredibly relevant to fire, and there's so much there that we can learn from. One of the things that really spoke to me in her book is a whole section on desire, and on how it's much more empowering to be working toward a vision of something that that you really want, empowerment to work toward a way of being for which you yearn. And I see this with fire, that for so long we've been interacting with fire and really focusing on the things we don't want from fire. We have failed in large part as dominant society in identifying the ways that fire can enrich in our lives and our landscapes and give us what we need. And I think that's really the centerpiece of that idea of cultural burning, is that fire can be a gift in giving us what we need and what we want. And our health is intricately connected to the health of our landscapes. So I really like this idea of building resilience and moving in a direction that is really focused on values and desire for a better future. Highly recommend checking out this book. It's got some great tools and strategies that I think we all can learn from. So I want to share a little bit about my work and the work that I do mostly with prescribed fire. That's really my passion, is around connecting people with fire and using prescribed fire as a venue to connect people with the landscape and with each other, and to build networks and to recreate a stewardship ethic that is centered on fire and fire use. And so I really see this as connected with the pieces that Sarah talks about. I am driven by the human connection, the fun, the passion around this work. For me, it's not about fear. It's not about preventing wildfire. It's really about forging a new path that is positive and beneficial. So I'll start out talking a little bit about prescribed fire training exchanges. And I have the honor of co-leading the TREX Coaches Network, which is an international group of leaders who are hosting these prescribed fire training events all over the world and across the country. And these events are so powerful because they are providing opportunity for all different kinds of people to get prescribed fire experience and to train together and to work together and build networks that are, in the absence of TREX, would not even exist. There are very few opportunities for folks like me who don't work in fire management, don't work for a major fire suppression agency, to get experience and to really learn the art and skill of prescribed fire. So we bring folks together for 2-week events, hands-on live fire training all over the place in different habitat types and different settings with different partners. And we're able to, provide training both in the prescribed fire implementation, but also in outreach and in fire ecology and policy, and just this really mixed model of training that gives such a rich experience. I also have the honor of leading Women in Fire Treks. So this is a Treks event that's much the same as, as the model that we use in other places. But the W Treks is focused on women in fire. And so every year we host an event in a different place across the country. So we've been in California, we've been in Florida. This year we had an event planned in Virginia that we had to postpone because of the coronavirus. But it's a really powerful event. And again, bringing all different kinds of people together from state and federal agencies, non-governmental organizations, tribes, international folks, and providing an opportunity and a venue for people to train and learn together. So these Treks events are very powerful and novel in the fire context. And really the work that we're doing is about changing the fire culture and being more inclusive, highlighting diversity and equity, and just really focusing on making fire as a whole more equitable and more thoughtful, and giving people more a kind of a deeper and more holistic training. So these are just really powerful events. Now, I also do a lot of work with community-based prescribed fire here in California. And this is something that I see as incredibly important to promoting a new fire culture and moving in a more positive direction. I've taken some of those principles of the Treks events, that the Fire Learning Network and the Nature Conservancy have been able to innovate over the last decade. I've taken some of those principles and brought them to a more local context. And about 10 years ago, and for many, many decades before that, there were very few options and opportunities for private landowners to use prescribed fire or to gain skill and experience in prescribed fire. Most prescribed fire in California, and I think this is true across the West, has been in the hands of fire management agencies, fire suppression agencies. And there's been very little engagement with the private land sector. Though we know that, the history and the roots of prescribed fire really are in the average people. And Native Americans clearly for millennia and still today have a wealth of information. These are the original innovators of prescribed fire. The ranching community has a deep, deep connection with fire as well in California. And so this era, this last 50 to 100 years in California has really been new for fire. It's not always been that the fire suppression culture owned prescribed fire. So what we're trying to do is bring fire back to the people. And we went to the Great Plains, my colleague and I, we went out to Nebraska to try to learn more about prescribed burn associations, which are essentially community cooperatives for prescribed fire. And we were so impressed with the level of grassroots engagement and capacity to do these projects that we had to bring that model back to California. So in 2017, we came back from Nebraska and started hosting some burns that were staffed entirely by community members and by volunteer fire departments, and really set forth a new path for prescribed fire on private lands in California. We formed the Humboldt County Prescribed Burn Association in 2018, which was the first prescribed burn association in the Western US. And since then, as you can see on this map, there's just been an explosion of interest in this kind of work. So the blue counties are places where prescribed burn associations have formed already and are burning together and having this really community-based approach. The orange counties are the places where they are just in the process of forming, And the yellow counties are places where they are having conversations about forming. My guess is that in the next few years, the whole state of California will be blue. And there will be active community-based prescribed fire groups burning all over the state and proliferating this idea that people have a connection with fire, people have the right to use it, and that this is something that should be local and focused on stewardship. And it's just a really exciting movement that's happening in California, and I hope to see it spread throughout the West as well. I really think at the end of the day that this is the kind of picture that I want to see. When people think about prescribed fire, I want people to see themselves there. I want people to think of, you know, an average land manager. This is my colleague Jeff on a burn that we did a couple of Decembers ago in our deciduous oak woodlands, and I just love this photo. I think it captures so much. It's simple, it's beautiful, and it's about people being stewards of the land and prescribed fire being a land management tool, not just a fire management tool. This is so essential. So I think it's important for us to remember that we don't have the option of not living with fire in the West or even nationally. We, you know, even those of us who don't work in fire, I'm sure many of you who are watching this presentation don't actually work in fire or even have a clear connection with fire, but you're seeing it increasingly bleed into your work and come up as an issue for you, whether you're in fisheries or you know, forestry or whatever you're doing. Fire is so important, and we do have the power to help shape fire. So let's use this moment as an opportunity to reclaim it, to reclaim our connection to it, and to make bold policy and management and even philosophical moves that can help us rebuild and renew a fire culture that actually makes sense for us. I think if we're not explicit that the work we're doing is actually about culture change and about shifting perspectives and opening our minds to new opportunities and new ways of thinking about things, then we won't be able to get where we need to go. So thank you so much. I really appreciate the opportunity to give this talk, and I will answer a few questions that came in through the chat. So I'm just going to pull those up and speak to those. So one person wrote and asked, the media reporting handbook teaches junior reporters that it's most important to get how many acres were destroyed. Never a mention of benefits. Do we need a new loss benefit statistic? I love this question. And I mean, you heard me say how I feel about the focus, the incessant focus on acres. Yes, we do need a new metric and a new way of thinking about fire. And it does need to be focused on those values that I brought up, and you know, how much has been lost or how much has been gained, and what do we really need to focus on and care about as a society when we think about fire. So yeah, the media reporting that's focused on just fire size, it's so shallow of a way to look at fire. There's so much more to the story. Great question. There was also a question about community-based prescribed fire, and does California have a right to burn law? And is this an issue in urban interface areas? So California, we do have the right to burn. It is in our public resource code, not in those words, but and some states do have those exact words, right to burn laws. But what we do have is language that describes that prescribed fire is a rightful tool for landowners, and you know, we have a whole process around how you can go about getting a permit and using prescribed fire on your private lands. So yes, we do have that right. And I think as far as the wildland urban interface goes, we have huge opportunity to use prescribed fire. It may be counterintuitive to think that prescribed fire is an appropriate tool around homes and around communities, but it's actually one of the best tools we have for reducing wildfire hazard and reducing fuels. And you can do it very safely. It's all about planning and making sure that your project is planned out and that you have an appropriate prescription. And then when the conditions are right, you can get in there and use prescribed fire with great success. We've done a lot of burning in California, and in the county where I live, we've done quite a bit of burning right around homes and for wildfire protection. So I think this is a hugely important tool for that. There's also a question about liability, and this of course is a very complex issue, and it depends on the state. Each state has a different liability law that generally fall into a couple different categories. And in California, we have a simple negligence liability law, which is actually fairly conducive to prescribed fire. It means that if you're practicing due diligence and you're doing everything as you should, and you've gone through a good planning process and you have appropriate resource and staffing for burns, and something goes wrong, that you do have some protection under the law. Other states have gross negligence laws, which are essentially the same, but only much more conducive, because you would have to be shown to have been grossly negligent in order to be held liable. So the states that have the most successful and robust prescribed fire programs are certainly the ones that have gross negligence laws. California, we're kind of middle of the road, and there are ways to deal with liability. You can hire a private burn boss who has insurance. There's a new state certified burn boss program that's rolling out in California that's going to offer liability sharing options and opportunities with CAL FIRE. But there's work to be done here. And I think we still need to be working on better insurance options, maybe on changes to liability law. Certainly the states in the West that do not have an explicit liability law, it would be, a great movement would be toward defining liability and actually developing some clarification on that, because that is a huge problem in those states. So I know there are several states that have prescribed fire councils that are working on that issue and hopefully get more clarification on that. The only other question, and I mentioned this briefly in the presentation, there was a question about the WTREX that was planned for Virginia in March of 2020 that we did postpone. And we're hoping to host that next March in Virginia. We will be offering all the slots to the folks who were, who had been accepted for the 2020 event. So I'm still not sure what our plan will be and if we'll even be able to host it in person. So if you are interested in learning more about that, please feel free to reach out and send me an email. You can find me on the conference website, or just Google my name and find my email, and I can put you on my mailing list for WTREX or for other TREX events. And with that, I'll close. Thank you so much, and I hope the conference goes well.